Gareth, also known as Beaumains, the youngest of the Orkney siblings, and probably the most tragic character in Arthurian legend. By looking into her class, design, skill set, backstory, and characterization, how well does the Gareth of the Fate franchise compare with her mythical counterpart? And what grade would I give her depiction? Let's get into it. Gareth is a Lancer class servant, which is a great choice for her. While Gareth did use a sword at times, her most impressive feats were achieved with a lance. It's not a magic lance or anything like that. In fact, it wasn't even hers originally. She took it from Sir Kay. Same goes for the shield. But in her subsequent battles against the four Color Knights and Sir Ironside, she would defeat all of them using that lance, and that was just the start. Lancer is an excellent pick for Gareth. Getting into her character design, we get to start with gender because Gareth has been flipped from the original. So what justification do they give for flipping Gareth? Well, as far as I can tell, they don't bother, they just do it. In the legends, Gareth plays a small but important role, the youngest of the Orkney brothers who is tragically killed by the knight he looks up to most, Lancelot. By all accounts, Gareth was one of the better Knights of the Round Table, not only in skill, but also in character. His story is probably the saddest in Arthurian legend, and it is his death that provokes Gawain's fury towards Lancelot, the fighting between them, and giving Mordred the opportunity to launch their rebellion. And while Gareth's story does involve him fighting for and marrying the Lady Lyonesse, you don't really hear much about it after that. In other words, Gareth is the good little brother who was well liked by most everyone, and his death basically broke the Round Table. Maybe the Fate writers thought that turning Gareth into a little sister might have a greater impact. That's the only idea I have for why they did it. But to be perfectly honest, aside from a few small moments like in Gareth's Interlude, her being gender flipped doesn't change the character much at all. As for her actual design, Gareth's ascensions very much follow the course of her adventures. You start off with Gareth when she arrives at Camelot, her identity still hidden as she works in the kitchens, wearing modest clothing as a result. Her second ascension is Gareth on her adventures, accompanying Lady Lyonette as she journeys to free Lyonette's sister, Lady Lyonesse. Lastly, we have Gareth as a Knight of the Round Table, having tossed away the shield she took from Sir Kay, but upgraded to some really fancy armor. All of this makes for an excellent overall design for Gareth. I have nothing to complain about here. But there is one peculiar thing that's worth talking about, her haircut, and how it kinda looks like she has dog ears. This is a recurring theme with Fate's version of Gareth, comparing her to a wolf, dog, or puppy. She even gets a dog companion for her summer version. Now, it says in Gareth's profile that she once jousted against King Arthur and, in recognition of Gareth's skill, the king likens her to a rampaging wolf. There's just one small problem. For the life of me, I can't find that story. It's a lot like Merlin and the whole Mage of Flowers business. No matter how much I dig, I can't find a trace of it in the legends. The only thing I did find was a Disney story where all the Round Table Knights get turned into animals. And in that, Gareth and the other Orkney siblings aside from Mordred get turned into wolves. But that seems to be a fan concept for a Disney story. It doesn't seem to actually exist. And so, until it is proven otherwise, there is no link between Gareth and wolves, dogs, or puppies. Or at least, there isn't an overt one. One of the defining aspects of Gareth's character is her loyalty to Lancelot, her admiration for him, and absolute refusal to act against him. It's a major part of what makes her ultimate fate so tragic, to be killed by the one she held in highest regard. But I suppose you could argue that Gareth's loyalty to Lancelot is kinda like a dog's, since Gareth's dedication to Lancelot was unwavering and unbreakable. Perhaps the writers decided to take that aspect of her character and ran with it, to give her these little links to canines as a symbolic representation of Gareth's loyalty and dedication. If that's the case, I can approve of that. Moving into her skill set, Gareth's first skill is Battle Continuation, which becomes the Wolf Never Sleeps after an upgrade. Battle Continuation is a generic skill we see often, representing one's ability to survive, their resilience, and dedication in the face of mortal danger. Does Gareth qualify for that? Absolutely. Her endurance is something to behold, particularly in her legend where she goes up against a succession of powerful knights, all of whom are thought to be much stronger than she is, and yet she manages to overcome them all in duels lasting for hours, with the duel against Sir Ironside lasting an entire day. I'll get into more detail about Gareth's story later, but she certainly deserves this skill. As for the upgrade name, well, I already talked about the wolf-dog thing, so I don't have anything else to add. Gareth's second skill is Gareth of the Beautiful Hands, which refers to the nickname that Sir Kay gave Gareth when she first arrived at Camelot. Since Gareth was much younger than all of her siblings, Gawain, Agravain, Gaheris, and Mordred, all of them left for Camelot when Gareth was still a child. When Gareth went to join them, she decided to take advantage of that fact, to see how other knights would treat her if they didn't know who she really was, and so finding out what kind of person they are. Rather than announcing that she was a sister of Gawain, and so guaranteeing her a place of honor in Camelot, Gareth instead went incognito, asking to work in the castle for a year before asking for 2 more favors once that year was done. Sent to the kitchens, Sir Kay was suspicious about this newcomer, noting that while Gareth was doing menial work, she had the soft hands of someone born into privilege, and so Kay gave her the nickname Beaumains, or Beautiful Hands. It was meant as an insult, and Kay would continue to be a jerk for that first year, but Gareth would ultimately have the last laugh. Lastly, Gareth's third skill is Ring of Transformation, a special ring given to Gareth by Lady Lyonesse at a jousting tournament being hosted by her. After rescuing Lady Lyonesse from Sir Ironside, Gareth falls for her and stays at her castle for a time, but Gareth's true identity is soon exposed by her mother Morgause, or in Fate, Morgan. King Arthur sends a message to Lady Lyonesse asking about Gareth, and her response was to host a tournament, Knights of the Round Table on one side, and any knight willing to face them on the other. This latter group actually attracted some formidable characters who would later become knights themselves, notably Tristan and Sir Palamide. Gareth would as well, but in order to keep her identity hidden, Lady Lyonesse gave Gareth this special ring that continuously changed how other people perceived Gareth, making her armor red at one moment, blue in the next, or green after that. It is also said that this ring also prevents the loss of blood, but that doesn't seem to be at play here. Gareth's noble phantasm is Ira Lupus, whereupon she charges in, smacks the enemy around with her lance, and then finishes them with a final strike. The name Ira Lupus means wrathful wolf in Latin. We get Latin here since Arthurian legend is supposed to take place shortly after the Romans withdrew from Britain, and so Latin would still be prominent. The name is another reference to the wolf business that I've already talked about, but the MP itself is something different. It relates to Gareth's impressive string of victories in jousting tournaments. Following up from what I just covered with that special ring, Gareth entered that tournament and faced off against a succession of knights, defeating 11 of them. You get their names in Gareth's FGO profile. After that, King Arthur asked Lancelot to go next, but he declined, saying that Gareth was likely exhausted after those matches, and it would be better to let Gareth be the winner of the day. This, combined with Gareth's other victories before this tournament, are what this MP is meant to symbolize, her superb skill with a lance that made her such a formidable opponent. Gareth's craft essence is Ring of Transformation, which I already covered with her third skill. The CE's text talks about how the ring is able to conceal Gareth's identity, but also much more than that. The day after Gareth's victory over the 11 knights, it was a melee battle on foot, where Gareth also did well. But during a break, one of his companions swiped the ring, dispelling the illusions, though Gareth's true identity still wasn't revealed. She then fought her older brother, Gawain, and actually managed to beat him despite this being during daytime hours. It was after this that Gareth's identity was finally revealed, leading her to being welcomed as a full knight of the Round Table. Gareth's Valentine C is chocolate cupcakes, depicting some chocolate cupcakes. Yum. In the text, it says that these cupcakes were made for Gawain, Lancelot, Mordred, Jekyll, and the protagonist. It also says that Gareth hopes that, someday, maybe Agravain could enjoy them too. But he's still in NPC jail and so can't come to Chaldea just yet. But this also might be a reference to their relationship though, since while Gareth was well liked by most everyone, she didn't get along too well with her brothers Agravain and Gaheris. The main sticking point was their tendency to engage in dishonorable behavior, such as the murder of Sir Lamorak. Notably, Gareth was the only one of the 5 Orkney siblings who didn't take part in that. Now for characterization, starting with a look into the legends surrounding Gareth. Gareth first appeared in Perceval, the Story of the Grail, written by Chrétien de Troyes in the late 12th century, or rather the first continuation of it, likely written by Wauchier de Dunat around 50 years later. Gareth is only a minor character at first, but growing in importance in the following centuries. Gareth is Gawain's favorite sibling, is noticeably less vengeful and murder-happy than the other brothers, particularly Gaheris and Agravain, and his death at the hands of boars during Lancelot's rescue of Guinevere helped lead to the fall of Camelot. Later on, of course, Gareth would be killed not by boars, but by Lancelot himself. But it is in Malory's Le Morte d'Arthur that Gareth gets his own adventure, which is rather interesting since while much of Malory's work is him compiling the writings of others into a coherent narrative, what he wrote about Gareth is his original work. Gareth is the youngest son of King Lot of Orkney and his wife Morgause, the half-sister of King Arthur. Like his older brothers aside from Mordred, this makes Gareth the nephew to both King Arthur and Morgan Le Fay. But as I mentioned earlier, Gareth is considerably younger than all of his siblings, and so Gareth didn't go to Camelot at the same time as Gawain, Agravain, or Gaheris. But when Gareth comes of age, he too decides to set out for Camelot, though as I mentioned earlier, he decides to do things differently, going incognito together with a dwarf and 2 others, then petitioning King Arthur to allow him to stay and work at Camelot for a year, then to be able to ask for 2 other favors a year later. This is accepted, and Gareth ends up in the castle's kitchens, where he is belittled and mocked by Sir Kay, given the nickname of Beaumains, beautiful hands. Kay thinks that this obviously highborn servant must be some kind of spy or troublemaker, but Gawain and Lancelot don't approve of Kay's mistreatment, offering Gareth better lodgings, clothes, and money. Gareth declines the help though, instead choosing to spend the next year in Camelot's kitchens, learning about the other knights, and watching every jousting tournament that he could. A year later, a lady arrived in Camelot asking for help, saying that her sister was trapped in her castle by the Red Knight of the Red Lands, Sir Ironside. The lady hoped to ask for Lancelot, but then Gareth stepped forth to make his other 2 requests, that he be the one to take on this quest, and, if he should prove worthy, to be knighted by Lancelot. The king accepted these terms, but the lady stormed out of the castle, annoyed that she was only getting a mere kitchen servant to help her. Gareth's companions then unveiled the armor and sword that had been secretly delivered for him. Then he set out to chase after the lady. He reached her, but shortly after was confronted by Kay, who charged at him. Despite only being armed with a sword against the lance and shield of Kay, Gareth managed to dismount him, then took Kay's lance and shield since Gareth didn't have either of those things. Gareth then comes up against another, much more dangerous opponent, Lancelot, who had been quietly following to see how things might go. Gareth and Lancelot would first fight on horseback, then on foot, and for perhaps the first time in his life, Lancelot found himself in trouble. This kitchen servant, whose identity he still did not know, was so ferocious and fought with a skill beyond what his small frame would suggest that it led to Lancelot ending the fight in a draw, worried that he might actually lose. This is one of only 2 occasions in all of Arthurian legend where Lancelot doesn't defeat his opponent. Gareth was the first, and the second, well, we will get to him before long. After such a display of skill, Gareth told Lancelot his true identity, asked him to keep it secret for now, and Lancelot knighted him. After this, Gareth caught up with the lady again while Lancelot went to go check on Sir Kay, still alive, but humiliated by this kitchen servant. Despite having seen him defeat Sir Kay and force Lancelot into a draw, the lady was still very rude to Gareth, telling him that he stunk of the kitchen. They soon came across a lord being held hostage by bandits, who Gareth freed, and the lord invited them to stay at his castle as thanks, though again the lady complained about having to sit next to this kitchen boy. The next day, the party ran into the first of the 5 knights that were troubling her sister, a knight dressed in all black. She warned Gareth of the knight's skill, that he should run away, but Gareth did not hesitate, attacking and striking down the Black Knight with his lance. After this, the pair came against 3 other color knights, a green knight, a red knight, and an indigo knight, each stronger than the last. Gareth defeats them all, the knights surrender, and Gareth sends them to Camelot to serve King Arthur. After defeating the Red Knight, the third of the 4, the lady finally apologizes for being such a jerk, and finally tells Gareth her name, Lady Lynette of Castle Perilous, and her sister is Lady Lyonesse. Gareth's dwarf companion tells her some more about Gareth, but not yet who he actually is. From there, the group proceeds further, encountering the grim handiwork of their final opponent, 40 knights all hanging from trees on the road to Castle Perilous. Finally, they reach the castle and meet their final enemy, the Red Knight of the Red Lands, Sir Ironside, besieging the castle whilst Lady Lyonesse watches from a castle balcony. Sir Ironside claims that he will continue to lay siege to the castle until Lady Lyonesse accepts him, but Gareth, upon seeing Lady Lyonesse from afar, immediately falls for her, getting another reason to pursue this quest. He challenges Sir Ironside, fighting him in a grueling battle lasting all day until, eventually, Gareth manages to defeat him. It is only then that Sir Ironside tells his story, that he was doing all this for another lady, a lady who had lost a brother to either Gawain or Lancelot. He was causing such a scene in the hopes of attracting the attention of Lancelot or Gawain, and then defeating them in order to get this lady revenge for her fallen brother. Feeling sympathetic, Gareth decides not to kill Sir Ironside, instead asking him to surrender to Lady Lyonesse, then join his fellows at Camelot to serve King Arthur, and apologize to Gawain and Lancelot in penance for all those other knights he had killed. Gareth, meanwhile, has something else on his mind, the Lady Lyonesse, who he now hopes to get as his bride. She has already warmed to him since Gareth had rescued her, but she still wants to get to know him a bit first, asking him to stay for a year. During that time, she captures Gareth's dwarf and forces him to tell her Gareth's true identity. Also, there's a bunch of shenanigans where Gareth and Lady Lyonesse want to get to know each other better, but Lynette and others ensure that this can't happen until there's a proper wedding between them. Meanwhile, Sir Ironside arrives at Camelot and tells his story, following the green, red, and indigo knights who had come before him. King Arthur is impressed by this, hoping to invite this kitchen servant to become a full knight of Camelot. But it is at this point that another guest arrives, Lady Morgause, and she is very upset. She wants to know where her son Gareth is, what has happened to him, and why he isn't at Camelot to meet her there. Only then does King Arthur and the rest, aside from Lancelot, finally learn that the kitchen servant is actually Gareth, the youngest of the Orkney brothers. Learning that Gareth is staying with Lady Lyonesse, King Arthur sends a message to her to ask about Gareth. What follows from here are the events I described earlier in this video: the tournament, the magic ring that obscured Gareth's identity, the succession of jousts, before Gareth is finally recognized after defeating his brother Gawain. And so, after around 2 years of kitchen work, adventure, and shacking up with Lady Lyonesse, Gareth is accepted as a Knight of the Round Table, and he and Lady Lyonesse get married. After this grand adventure, though, Gareth's plot relevance basically vanishes until the very end of the story. Really, Mallory did Gareth a great service by giving him his own adventure, because otherwise Gareth would have as little to work with as Bedivere does. Despite being depicted as a highly skilled combatant and an overall good person, Gareth is suspiciously absent from the Grail quest, only briefly meeting Galahad before everyone else set out to find the Grail. It is only after the Grail quest that we get the tragic final act. Agravain and Mordred want to expose Lancelot's affair with Guinevere, but Gareth, who is deeply loyal to Lancelot, wants absolutely nothing to do with that. After Lancelot is caught and Agravain is killed, the king reluctantly sentences Guinevere to death for treason. Gawain refuses to attend the execution, but Gareth and his older brother Gaheris are forced to attend, though they do so without wearing any weapons or armor, their own way of showing that they are not there willingly. Despite that, when Lancelot arrives to rescue Guinevere, he goes on a mad rampage, killing 24 Round Table knights in the process, and, in the middle of that, he unwittingly kills both Gaheris and Gareth, crushing Gareth's skull. It is only afterward that Lancelot learns who he had killed, and it is devastating for him. So it is for everyone else, since Gareth was well liked by almost everyone, and so for him to be killed, and at the hands of the one who knighted Gareth and who he looked up to most, it was a tragedy. But sadness was not the only emotion being felt. Gawain, having lost 2 other brothers and 2 sons to Lancelot's 2 rampages, took the death of Gareth particularly hard, swearing revenge against his old friend. What followed after that, I cover in my earlier videos on Gawain, Lancelot, King Arthur, and Bedivere. Question: I know I brought this up before, but how do you all feel about me creating a video series telling the full story of Arthurian legend? To not tell it character by character, but to go through the narrative as it happens. Let me know if there's any interest in that. Moving to the Fate franchise, we first meet Gareth in the Camelot Singularity, or rather we hear that she was there. Before Chaldea arrives, she is one of the knights who sides with the Lion King, but having been sickened by having to kill her fellow knights, Gareth falls into a deep depression, constantly washing her hands, and so ruining the beautiful hands she is known for. In the final battle against Richard the Lionheart, she holds Richard down so that Gawain can finish the 2 of them off, having lost the will to continue with the Lion King's plan. It's another tragic ending for Gareth, and it further hardens Gawain into maintaining his loyalty to the Lion King, if only to justify the additional sunk cost of having killed not only other Round Table knights, but his own sister as well. The first time we actually meet Gareth face to face is in Summer 3, where she has a brief cameo showing up to buy the group's dojin about the Knights of the Round Table, and then visiting another booth featuring what sounds like a lewd story involving Sir Kay and King Pellinor. Gareth decries this as repugnant, but tries to buy a copy anyway, only to be told that she needs ID. Gareth isn't named here, but her identity is teased since Sir Kay is the one who gave her a hard time before getting humiliated, and King Pellinor is the man who killed her father, King Lot, later to be avenged by Gawain and Gaheris. A year later, Gareth becomes an official servant in FGO, having been introduced during the 4th anniversary. She pops in during Summer 4, where she is part of that particularly brutal scene where Moriarty exploits Lancelot's guilt over killing Gareth, distracting him so that he can be more easily beaten in a fight. Now, the stuff that Moriarty says is all true, but yikes. That scene stands out for being unusually heavy for a summer event. Gareth later gets her own summer version in Summer 7, which, as we later find out, actually takes elements from Sir Ironside, her main opponent in her legend. He actually makes an appearance as one of the spirits haunting the haunted house run by Wu Zetian and Shuten Doji, where Gareth fights and defeats him. This is actually her most recent appearance in an event at the time of recording, and I see it as an encouraging sign that elements of Gareth's story aside from being brutally murdered are starting to get attention in FGO. But as interesting as her appearances during summer events are, Gareth truly gets to shine in 2 other stories. First is her own Interlude, where she warmly greets the Saber Lancelot, but is understandably uncomfortable around Zerker Lancelot. Percival and Shuten Doji decide to help Gareth out, arranging for a fight in the simulator between Gareth and Zerker Lancelot. It gives Gareth a moment to sort through her own feelings, and so to allow her to at least not freeze up around Zerker Lot anymore. They do add the idea that Gareth might have been attracted to Lancelot, which, well, it's not in the legends, but it's not too big of a leap either, especially since they decided to flip Gareth. It's one of my favorite interludes in the entire game, giving Gareth a chance to deal with the most traumatic episode from her life, and so find a way to overcome it. The other story Gareth gets to shine in is Lostbelt 6, Avalon Le Fay, though this has to come with the caveat that this is Lostbelt Gareth, not proper history Gareth. It's similar to the situation with Percival, and yet, despite that, the Gareth depicted here is still very much like the Gareth of Arthurian legend. She is a young follower who gets inspired by Artoria Castor, becoming her first local companion on the pilgrimage. Gareth looks up to those around her as examples to follow, hoping that she might become skilled enough to stand together with her allies. And yet, Gareth consistently shows that she doesn't actually need to prove herself, because she's quite skilled as a combatant already, ensuring that the party not only survives its battle against Woodwoes, but is able to defeat him. Then, of course, there's the fact that Lostbelt Gareth has a tragic ending, when Aurora sneaks her forces into Londinium to massacre the civilians there. Gareth puts up a heroic last stand and kills most of the attackers, but she is fatally wounded by Lancelot, or rather Tamlin Lancelot, Melusine. Lastly, Gareth's death in Lostbelt 6 is, in many ways, the harbinger of things to come. While the story had seen plenty of tragedy and character deaths before her, Gareth's death pretty much heralds the start of the final act of the story, when everything falls apart and characters start dying like flies. Lostbelt Gareth might technically be different from her proper history version, but thematically and in personality, she is much like her proper history self, a wonderful, earnest person who suffers a tragic end. And now for the verdict. What grade would I give Gareth's depiction in Fate Grand Order? Well, her character design and skill set are pretty good, even if her connection to wolves or dogs isn't found in the Gareth from the legends. There's also that they decided to gender flip Gareth without even trying to justify it, though this isn't too serious. The reason why is because, as far as characterization goes, the Gareth of FGO is quite excellent. It doesn't really matter that they gender flip the character. For our purposes, this is Gareth from Arthurian legend. While her tragic death might be the part Fate gives the most attention to, we are starting to get bits of Gareth's other stories, such as the battle against Sir Ironside that we saw in Summer 7. The main takeaway I have about Gareth is that while many details about her character have been altered, the gender flip, the connection to canines, and the fact that her biggest story appearance is actually her Lostbelt version, underneath all that, it's still Gareth. The gender flip doesn't really change the character too much. The canine connection is fine because it hints at Gareth's loyalty and dedication, and her Lostbelt version, while technically a different character, is still very similar to proper history Gareth. In other words, while some details have been altered, the Gareth of Fate Grand Order is, in spirit, very much like her original in Arthurian legend. And so for a final grade, I'm going to give Gareth, also known as Beaumains, a B+. If you would like to learn more about the knight Gareth looked up to, and who ultimately killed her, check out my video on Lancelot here. Until next time.